One of the most common questions among new writers is, how do you write effective dialogue? You'd think it would be a simple matter of transposing conversation, since we're pretty good at actually speaking with each other. But when confronted with the blank page and deciding what a character will say, we often find ourselves befuddled. To answer that question, let's begin by thinking about what dialogue actually does. And to me, the simplest way of thinking about it is as the language of conflict, by which we mean the conflict that we see externally, the posture that the character is taking, their rhetorical position. Are they being threatening? Are they trying to seduce? Are they simply describing something? Versus what they're feeling, which is often expressed in that posture. It may be rage, it may be desire, it may be pride. These are all external things. We can see them or we can perceive them from the way that the character is speaking or positioning themselves to other characters. The more complicated questions have to do with what's going on internally with a character. There is the thing that the character says, but it is often in conflict with what they mean to say, because either they're trying to hide something or they are not particularly effective communicators, versus what they're actually thinking, which may be something beyond what they mean to say. In other words, they, in the position of the seducer, for example, that they may just be thinking, I want to have sex with this person, but that isn't what they intend to say. They wouldn't necessarily, except in extraordinary circumstances, actually come out and say that, versus what the character doesn't actually realize what they mean, what's underneath the surface of whatever the fear or desire that's being expressed in what they're thinking and what they intend to say and what they actually say. So there's a very rich kind of internal turmoil, again, conflict going on with the character, which is manifest in what they finally say. To understand how dialogue operates as conflict, it's worth kind of drawing back a little further and thinking about how dialogue advances the story. And it does this in two primary and complementary ways. The first is, broadly speaking, to carry the drama, which is to say to move the action along or to move our sense of the momentum of the story along. And it will do this by things like illustrating goals and highlighting obstacles that may already be there or may be imminent in some way or other, or, may be predictive of obstacles. Generally, dialogue doesn't do this directly. We try as often as we can to avoid what's called on-the-nose dialogue, where a character is saying exactly what they're thinking or they're simply delivering information. The second quality of dialogue, of course, is giving context, which we think of generally as exposition. That is to say, backstory or, some sort of framing that helps us to understand what's happening in a scene. It tends to be generally just informational in bad writing, and in good writing it tends also to express the conflict. So the two things overlap with each other, that a character may be giving us necessary information, but they're giving it to us in a posture of conflict, that they're in an argument with someone and a piece of information comes out, or they're overwhelmed by an emotion and something is revealed. Ideally, we want exposition always to be part of the carrying of the drama, that it shouldn't simply be about delivering information. So if dialogue is also serving these goals of advancing the story, then we need some rules for writing it. Of course, by rules, I simply mean suggestions, and here I am providing a list of my do's and don'ts of dialogue, and you can take or leave them as you wish. The first of them is not to simply record speech. The dialogue should do what speech does, which is evade, worry, wonder, blurt out, all those sorts of things that happen in conversation, and it should sound the way that speech does. But it needs to be much more concentrated. Otherwise, it starts to get chatty and meandering the way that real conversation does, which if you recorded it, you would realize is actually generally pretty boring. We need our dialogue to be pithy. to focus on turning moments and finding a way to cut the rest of it out while we're writing it. So you might write a long bit of discursive dialogue and then come through and chop 75% of it out. The second is to avoid exposition whenever possible, and this is really important. We need background information. Sometimes we need plot descriptors that the primary narrator of the story won't give us, the first, third, or second person narrator. But we need to be really careful about how we diffuse or how we deploy this background information, this exposition, and be sure that it's also simultaneously describing conflict, as I said in the last slide. The third rule is to not write speeches, and this is a rule that nearly every writer breaks, because almost always in some story, a character is going to make some sort of declarative speech, a declaration of love or purpose or whatever the case may be. It's a very common thing. So when I say don't write speeches, I mean don't write speeches unless you absolutely have to, that there's something that's happening in the story that demands that a character pull the spotlight on themselves and essentially monologue. The fourth is to maintain the tension between the internal and the external. And this is something that I would emphasize over and over again. When I was talking about the relationship between the internal and the external earlier, this is essentially what I was getting at. That there's, as we talked about with characterization, what the character wants or needs and the ways in which the character manifests those things. Very often, the result of this is that what we get in the dialogue is, if not the opposite of, something very different from what the character would express if they were able to fully expose their motives and their hearts, their fears and their desires, that sort of thing. So what we call this is avoiding on-the-nose dialogue, that we want to make sure that that tension is there, so that we're compelling the reader to sort of think forward and think around what the motivation of the character is. Another rule or guideline for me is to create verbal cues whenever possible so that we know the difference between one character and another. And these verbal cues could be things like speech patterns or syntax or vocabulary, one or all of these things. Figures of speech, those sorts of things that a character uses that mark them out in one way or another. You might have a character who's very strident in the way they speak, another who takes long pauses, etc. Back to the idea of avoiding on-the-nose dialogue, reveal emotions without directly stating them. We should know what a character is feeling without them having to declare it. It may be therapeutically valuable to always name your emotions and speak them out loud, but it's rare that characters in a drama will do this because withholding them is a form of self-protection or of strategy or whatever. It's something that allows them to feel empowered within the story. So make us know what they're feeling without directly showing us or saying what they're feeling. And finally, don't be afraid of silence or silences. Pauses in dialogue, abrupt or truncated bits of dialogue that are surrounded by moments of pregnant silence where characters are, allowing feelings to sort of foment in relation to the other person or people that are in the space with them. The blank page can be a really valuable thing because it allows the reader to sort of sit with those possibilities, and more specifically with the conflict between what a character is saying, what they mean to say, what they're thinking, and what they're actually thinking, that sort of a thing. The best dialogue is always going to sort of draw that complexity, that drama, that conflict, internal, external, or both, to the surface.